Today we are talking about the global right wing, especially the far-right forces in Europe, and the fundamental reasons behind their landslide victories in recent elections. In recent years, if you regularly read the major Western, woke left newspapers like the New York Times, France's Le Monde, or Britain's Guardian, and wire services such as Reuters and Buy, you will notice that their pages are perpetually filled with grand and alarming phrases like darkest hour, democratic backsliding, and the specter of the far right haunting Europe. So why is that? Why are they so bitter, so deeply aggrieved, and so panic-stricken? Because during the election cycle from 2024 to 2026, Europe's political landscape has undergone a dramatic transformation. Let's first take a look at what exactly these old, wealthy Europeans have been going through over these years. First, let's look at the political reality of the EU. In the latest European Parliament elections, far-right and right-wing populist parties won more than a quarter of the seats. Groups like the Patriots for Europe and the Sovereignists tore a huge chunk of votes away from the traditional centrists, winning dozens of seats, each and instantly becoming formidable forces in the European Parliament. Second, let's examine the internal politics of individual European countries. In France, Macron went to extraordinary lengths to block Le Pen's far-right advance, even dissolving the National Assembly early in a political gamble. In the end, although he barely managed to keep the far right from an absolute majority through a tactical alliance of center-left forces, Le Pen's national rally still achieved a historic high number of votes, ultimately winning 88 seats in 2024, and roughly 104 seats together with its far-right allies, its base growing ever larger. Now look at Germany through the AfD, which mainstream media have lambasted as the twilight of Nazism, not only swept the state elections in the East, but also consistently ranks near the top in national polls. In the 2025 federal election, the AfD won 20.8% of the vote and won 52 seats, making it the second largest party. Currently, Germany is governed by a black-red coalition led by Merz's CDU-CSU together with the SPD, while the former traffic light coalition has been consigned to history by German voters. In Italy, Meloni has long been firmly in power. Don't be fooled by her meetings with Trump, where she might appear like a meek underdog. You need to see the other side of Meloni. During her campaign, her slogan was exactly the same as Trump's: Italians first. On policy, she firmly opposes LGBTQ+ rights, opposes same-sex couples adopting children, and advocates using the Navy to blockade the Mediterranean to stop illegal immigration. Moreover, the party she leads is called Brothers of Italy, which sounds almost like a mafia name. But that's not the point. Go back 3 generations, and this party can be directly traced to the Italian social movement, founded after Mussolini's fall. In other words, her party carries an indelible neo-fascist gene. So the far right has firmly taken root in Italy. Then, take the classic high-welfare Nordic countries, like Sweden and Finland. TUI, the far right there, is either directly in government, or has become a pivotal force that can sway parliament. Faced with this devastating political tsunami, the Western establishment, elite stabilisti who sip coffee in Brussels office towers, while debating climate change and gender equality are naturally very anxious. But what explanations do they offer? They say it's because populist politicians have deceived ignorant European masses with lies. They also claim that Putin is pulling the strings, using information warfare to tear European society apart. Furthermore, they argue that this is the most serious fascist revival since World War II and a wholesale retreat of democracy. In addition, a large portion of the woke left believes that China is covertly helping the far-right Ferdi reportedly. Macron himself holds this view. All these claims are nothing but sheer, arrogant nonsense. An ordinary European citizen simply doesn't have the spare time to worry about democratic backsliding or fascist revival. Every morning when they wake up, they care about only 3 things. First, how much does a loaf of bread cost? Second, has the winter heating bill gone up? And third, where exactly do my taxes go? So let's stop with the hollow narrative of democratic decline. The reason European voters so resolutely cast their ballots for the far right is not that they suddenly turned racist or fascist overnight. It's that they are furious, both physically and psychologically, over high inflation and unchecked refugee welfare. With their only weapon toy, the ballot toy, they do the most pragmatic economic arithmetic and end up supporting the far right. Isn't that simply the case? Today, let's follow this ledger and dissect Europe's rightward shift from the inside out, leaving nothing uncovered. The first account we need to settle for Europeans is the household wallet drained by inflation. To understand why Europeans are so angry, you have to first see what kind of life they've been living these past few years, ever since the Russia-Ukraine war broke out and Europe decoupled from Russian energy. Inflation has galloped ahead like a runaway horse. Let's look at a set of data released by Eurostat itself. In May 2026, the overall inflation rate in the Eurozone remained at 3.2%, and for the entire EU it was 3.3%. You might think that just over 3% doesn't seem very high. But first, the internationally accepted healthy inflation rate is below 2%. And don't forget TAIPI. This is an increase on top of the already surging prices from the previous years of the Russia-Ukraine war. Such inflation has many adverse consequences, but the most urgent and critical ones are energy and food. Again, according to Eurostat, in May 2026, the energy inflation rate in the Eurozone was still as high as 10.8%, unprocessed food inflation at 4%, eggs up 16.6%, automotive fuel up 18%, and so on. What does that mean? It means that while the headline figure of 3.3% is already high, the inflation on items that directly affect people's daily lives is even worse. Translated into real life, European citizens, whether German factory workers or French employees, after receiving their monthly pay, paying rent, and settling exorbitant electricity and gas bills, go to the supermarket only to find that even the most basic food prices are still climbing. Some say we shouldn't just look at the overall numbers, we should also look at incomes. Fine, let's see how European wages have been rising. The answer is hardly at all, or at least, wage growth simply cannot keep up with inflation. According to Eurostat's big data, in Q4 2025 hourly wage and salary costs in the Eurozone grew by 3% year-on-year, and in Q1 2026 by 3.4% highway, which looks close to inflation, but the breakdown tells a different story. France only rose 1.1%, Italy 2.3%, Germany 2.7%. This shows that the larger increases came from non-major economies, especially those Eastern European countries that have been ramping up military production due to the war. So in this situation, if you are an ordinary European, you turn on the television and see what your presidents and prime ministers are doing. They are debating how to allocate billions of euros to support wars in other countries. They are discussing costly green transitions. But the price of the green transition is that the people have to pay more taxes. They talk about carbon emissions and animal protection. So you touch your increasingly thin wallet, look at your living room, where you dare not turn on the heating to save on electricity. And what do you think? You must think. Are these politicians completely out of touch with reality? That is the first core logic behind the rise of far-right parties. They don't preach lofty values. They only talk about daily necessities. How did Le Pen campaign in the French election? She didn't bother debating Macron about the great potential of European integration. She just took a calculator, went to farmers' markets and gas stations every day, and told voters, if I take office, I will cut the VAT on energy from 20% to 5.5%, even if it means pushing for a Frexit. So ask yourself, for a French grandmother who can barely afford her electricity bill, would she prefer Macron's European strategic autonomy or Le Pen's promise to lower electricity costs? The answer is self-evident. Thus, the persistent inflation triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war is a ruthless wealth-sucking machine. Once it breaks through people's basic living standards, any grand narrative collapses instantly. At that moment, whoever promises to keep money in people's pockets gets their votes die. That is the most elementary political economy. Let me add one more point. Many people assume the poorest are the most likely to support the right wing. But it's not that simple. Those who are truly prone to shift right are often not the perpetually destitute, but rather those who once enjoyed a decent standard of living and now feel that they have lost it. A village that has always been poor sui. People may have long accepted that. But an industrial town that 20 years ago had factories, a railway station, and young people, and now sees factories closed, hospitals downsized, schools merged, and all the children moving to big cities. Sadly, that kind of decline is the most potent political catalyst. Economists in the capital tell these locals that national GDP is still growing, that the green transition is creating many new jobs, and that globalization is overall a net positive. But when they look around their hometowns, they see shuttered shops, falling house prices, and young people leaving. These people are not simply opposing modernization. Rather, they have not benefited from modernization, and have even been invisibly harmed by it. This is somewhat similar to America's rednecks. Here is another counterintuitive question. According to traditional political logic, when wages stagnate and inequality widens, shouldn't voters support the left, unions, or welfare policies? Why do they instead turn to the right and far right? There is a special nuance here. Today's European right-wing forces do not demand the complete dismantling of the welfare state. On the contrary, parties like Le Pen's, the Finns Party, and the Sweden Democrats sell a very particular political product. National welfare must be preserved, but it must be reserved exclusively for our own people. What defines our own people depends on how they draw the line. Second, the state should certainly remain strong kwai. It doesn't have to mean less state, more market state. It can also be more state, less market saibi. But it cannot treat everyone equally. Our own people must get the benefits of that state intervention, while outsiders must not take a share of the resources. Third, what do they say about pensions, healthcare, and housing? The state should continue spending, but only on specific groups, saibai, meaning only the native majority ethnic population should enjoy these benefits. This is the special product they sell, and in political science it has a specific name: welfare chauvinism. Many right-wing voters are not necessarily economically right-wing, in the traditional sense of Bowie. They may not support cutting pensions, privatizing healthcare, or cutting taxes for big capital. They may even favor more state intervention than centrists. Where they truly turn right is on questions of who is entitled to welfare, who belongs to our political community, and who should come first in resource distribution. That is what they care about. So we can see that many election polls and studies in Europe show that the success of far-right parties does not rely solely on cultural conservatives. Rather, they build a solid voter coalition by uniting those who worry about cultural change with those who fear that immigrants are competing for wages, housing, and welfare. So today's so-called right-wing and far-right are, in plain words, groups that are simply defending their own interests. Ideologically, they don't have an absolute lefty-right distinction, ID. It's just which party is willing to help me take back benefits, which party is willing to reclaim the resources given to immigrants and refugees and give them to me, which party is willing to stop sending national resources to outsiders. That's who I support. In reality, left and right are just labels they slap on each other. Now, the second account, the price of sanctimony and the bottomless pit of refugee welfare. If inflation merely makes Europeans feel financially squeezed, the refugee issue makes them feel profoundly unjust. And this is the sharpest political weapon for Europe's right and far right. Let's rewind a bit. In 2015, Merkel introduced an open-door refugee policy, welcoming refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, with her famous declaration, "Wir schaffen das," we can do it. Merkel earned a halo of humanitarianism, but the consequences were severe. Since then, millions of refugees have flooded into Europe. By 2026, solely due to the Russia-Ukraine war, the number of people under temporary protection in the EU reached 4.38 million TOE. And that does not even include illegal migrants who crossed from the Middle East and Africa by boat. Many people in China may not have a clear sense of what 4.38 million means. It seems less than the population of one of our provincial capitals. But you have to know that in Europe, many historic cities and national capitals have very small populations. For example, Brussels, the capital of Belgium, has about 1.2 million people. Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands, about 900,000. Dublin, capital of Ireland, about 550,000. Copenhagen, capital of Denmark, about 600,000. So if you add up the entire resident populations of these four classic European capitals, Brussels, Amsterdam, Dublin, and Copenhagen, you barely get 3.25 million people. That means that the current number of Ukrainian refugees under temporary protection in the EU is equivalent to the combined population of those four capitals, plus the entire city of Barcelona in Spain. Moreover, these people have, within just a few years, effectively jumped the queue into Europe's already overburdened public transport, hospitals, and schools. The total EU population is about 450 million, so 4.38 million refugees means that today, for every 100 people in the EU, there's permanently one Ukrainian refugee with temporary protection status, and they are highly concentrated in wealthy countries like France and Germany. So while Ukraine itself lies in ruins from the war, a vast number of Ukrainians have thereby gained the opportunity to live long-term in Europe. Now, most of these Ukrainian refugees do not engage in traditional heavy manual production, nor do they generate core wealth, and they pay little or no high income tax. Why? Yet they consume the same public resources and share the same fiscal budget as the other 99 local residents. And that's not counting the legal Ukrainian refugees alone, as I said. We haven't even counted the illegal migrants who keep coming in small boats from the Middle East and Africa. It is actually quite ironic here. Before the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, Ukraine was among the poorest countries in Europe, in terms of GDP per capita, so barely over $4,000, less than a quarter of neighboring Poland's. For a young Ukrainian, staying home meant earning a meager $200, $300 a month, enduring oligarchs and rampant corruption, foray a miserable prospect. But if they could get EU association status, they could legally go to Poland to wash dishes, to Germany for construction work, to France to pick grapes, earn euros, send money back home, and build a nice house in their village. That was their complete European dream. Europe, before the war, was reluctant to admit Ukraine into the EU precisely because Ukraine's economy was too weak and would drag the EU down. Yet today, according to multiple consecutive surveys by European think tanks and labor organizations, in 2025-2026, the employment rate of Ukrainian refugees staying in Europe has already exceeded 50%. In Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic, large numbers of young Ukrainian women and highly educated professionals have smoothly filled labor shortages in local care, hospitality, logistics, and even its sectors. They now live in European housing, earn euros or local currencies. Their children receive free Western-style education in public schools in Germany or Poland. And many are already planning how to accumulate residency years and apply for permanent settlement. Herein lies an extremely unfair allocation mechanism in European immigration politics, especially refugee politics. The benefits and the costs of immigration are often not borne by the same people in Europe. For example, large German companies get cheap labor, chain restaurants get Ukrainian waiters, care institutions get nurses, the National Statistics Office gets better employment figures and GDP hui. Even the German football team boosts its strength with many African heritage players. But the children of these new immigrants crowd into local public schools. The new patients fill up community clinics. The new families drive up rental prices in the neighborhood. These costs are not evenly spread across all Germans. A native German resident, for instance, does not see the dividends of the national team's success, but does face the reality of crowded schools for their own children and longer queues at the local clinic. So we see that these costs are concentrated in specific small towns, suburbs, and low-income communities. Thus, The benefits of immigration are national reflected in aggregate GDP figures, while the costs are local, felt as tangible burdens by ordinary residents on their daily commute, in their children's schools, and in the hospitals where their elderly parents seek care. The bureaucrats in Brussels see ample labor supply. Business owners see low hiring costs for immigrants and think the situation is great. Local residents see crowded schools with foreign students, the state continuously handing out subsidies to refugees, and dramatically longer waiting times for medical appointments. So the state, businesses, and ordinary people Saudi, they are all seeing the truth, but they live in completely different realities. So why did Europe refuse to let Ukraine join the EU before the war died, and still hesitates even now? With so many Ukrainians already staying in Europe, what is the essential difference from Ukraine joining the EU? And ironically, the war has already caused an irreversible demographic gap and hollowing out of Ukraine's population. When the war ends, how many of those 4 million plus people will actually want to return to their war-torn, debt-ridden homeland? Europe's current situation is truly riddled with contradictions. Let's get back to the impact of refugees on Europe. Earlier we mentioned Merkel's open-door humanitarian policy, 40 to the establishment, and woke left elites. It was certainly a humanitarian victory and a demonstration of Europe's moral high ground. Clinking their wine glasses, they reveled in their own kindness. But the question is, who is actually footing the bill for this kindness? It is the French workers living in the suburbs of Paris, the retired elderly in small German eastern towns, the ordinary Europeans who squeeze into the metro every day and pay heavy taxes. Europe is a high welfare society, and the essence of high welfare is a national social contract. We all work hard and pay up to 40% or even 55% in taxes, and in return the state provides a safety net in education, healthcare, and pensions. This is an extremely fragile balance, built on the equivalence of contribution and entitlement. But the massive influx of refugees has directly shattered this social contract. Imagine this scene: a German plumber at the bottom of the ladder, working hard from dawn to dusk, paying taxes for half his life. And now in his old age he finds that his pension is barely enough to survive. Then he steps outside and sees that next door has moved in a Ukrainian refugee family of 8. This family has hardly any stable long-term jobs, yet the government has given them a large house, high living allowances, and even medical care without waiting in line. And their children loiter on street corners, disturbing community order. Think carefully, Sibai. How ironic and infuriating is that picture? When resources were abundant and the economy was booming, Europe was willing to show humanitarianism. Solidarity, an extra bit of budget for outsiders, would not affect their own quality of life, and it allowed them to stand on the moral high ground of woke leftism. But when the overall economy declines and even ordinary people have to tighten their belts, the government still uses the people's hard-earned money to support foreign refugees. Naturally, the public becomes resentful. So right-wing parties campaign with very simple and blunt language. We must put our own people first, and those refugees who do not work for a long time and live solely on welfare should be repatriated. The woke left newspapers call this xenophobia, racism, or fascist ideology. But that is completely wrong. This is not racism at all. It is the most straightforward defense of interests, a defensive counter-strike by European taxpayers to protect their own rights. Why should I pay taxes and then pay for your excessive compassion? So isn't it only natural that people abandon the establishment and turn to the far right? And here is another ironic reality. Trump believes that Europeans are consuming American welfare, while European locals believe that refugees and Ukrainians are consuming European welfare. Tracing it all the way up, many fiscal burdens ultimately end up indirectly landing on the United States. So from Trump's perspective, he is naturally dissatisfied. I provide money to support Europe, and in return you use your budgets to house huge numbers of refugees. That is hard to swallow. There is another important point. In the refugee issue, what truly enrages Europeans is different from American feelings about illegal immigrants. What especially irritates Europeans is the starkly different faces that European states show to their own citizens versus to refugees. It is particularly glaring. Young locals go to the government and say they cannot afford rent, and the government tells them that's a problem of the private housing market. If you can't afford it, it's your own lack of effort. Residents complain about long waiting times for medical care, and the government replies that the healthcare system is understaffed. Locals report increasing numbers of outsiders and deteriorating public security, requesting more police, and the government declines, citing limited budgets. The overall message is the government is powerless to solve any reasonable demands from ordinary citizens. Yet when large numbers of Ukrainian refugees arrive, the government's executive capacity suddenly returns in full force. The state can urgently book hotels, rapidly mobilize construction and local funds, set up reception centers, fast-track Ukrainian children into schools, provide translation, medical care, and living subsidies, ID and refugees get medical treatment without any queues. The UK government has some shocking data. In the 2024-2025 fiscal year, the daily average cost of hotels used to house Ukrainian refugee applicants was about £5.77 million, and at its peak, the hotel accommodation system cost up to £9 million per Dalton wide. What does that mean? In one day, that's the equivalent of over 100 million RMB just to host Ukrainian refugees. Meanwhile, ordinary Britons have to wait several months just to see a Dr. Twee, such a salt. Such a stark contrast is simply unacceptable to the public. So this double standard is nothing short of political humiliation for ordinary Europeans. It turns out the state does have fiscal and executive capacity. ID just never prioritizes ordinary locals. The refugee crisis has not only undermined fiscal balance, but has also destroyed ordinary people's trust in the fairness of state distribution. Now that we've come this far, we can puncture the biggest lie of European politicians, the so-called democratic backsliding that the establishment constantly chants. I recently saw many European woke left scholars online emotionally denouncing the far right's rise as the darkest day for European democracy, which is quite laughable. Let me ask you, how did far right politicians get their power? Did they seize it through a military coup, a beer hall putsch, a Reichstag fire? Did they row tanks into the streets of Paris? Number every single vote they received was legally and properly cast by ordinary people in polling stations. If it was chosen by the people, one person, one vote, then it represents the truest public will Suri. That is democracy, isn't it? Why is it that when the people vote for you establishment parties, it's called a victory for democracy, but when they vote for the right, it's called a regression of the people? The subtext here is actually very sinister. In the eyes of multinational capital groups, Brussels, bureaucrats, and media elites, democracy is nothing more than a tool they use to promote globalization and preserve their own vested interests. As long as election results suit them, they praise the rules to the skies. Once the people use those very rules to overturn their policies, they immediately brand the people as ignorant mobs and label the election a democratic crisis. This is not democratic backsliding at all. On the contrary, it is democracy's most primal corrective mechanism, at work, reigning in the woke left establishment that has lost touch with the people. Isn't that the case? These European woke left elites have flown too high and been too far from the ground for the past 20 or 30 years. What does that mean? It means they have completely lost touch with the masses. What are the issues they care about? How to set carbon emission targets, how to design transgender bathrooms, how to use financial tools to harvest profits from global supply chains, how to fight an ideological proxy war in Ukraine, and how to accept unlimited Ukrainian refugees. And what do right-wing politicians care about? Keeping factories from closing, preventing refugee-related public security issues on the streets, stopping basic food prices from rising continuously, and ensuring that local jobs are not taken by foreign refugees. So this is not simply an ideological contest. In the eyes of ordinary people, it is a life and death struggle between the elites floating in the sky and the common people rooted in the earth. All those so-called universal values, climate environmentalism, and refugee rights, are actually luxury goods under the brand of woke left values. When the economy is growing fast and everyone's income is ample, people don't mind embracing some of these values. IT decorates society's facade and shows off their moral virtue fin. Isn't that fine? But once the economy stagnates and even food and heating require careful budgeting, who still cares about these spiritual luxuries? Everyone naturally reverts to the most basic needs, bread and security. It is precisely at this moment that far-right parties place bread and security on the table for the people. The people use their votes to settle accounts with unbalanced policies and kick out those politicians who force them to bear the costs of moral luxuries. Isn't that a perfectly logical outcome? Finally, the essence of this phenomenon goes beyond these surface issues. If it were only about inflation and refugees, it might not explain why not only Europe, but also the United States and many Asian countries are visibly shifting. Right? Behind all this lies a more brutal and fundamental reason: global economic slowdown. Past 2 decades. Let's look at some key data. First, global growth is weak. The IMF projects global growth of only 3% in 2026, well below the 3.5% average of 2024. 2025. Europe is the hardest hit region in the entire global data. Eurozone growth for 2026 has been brutally downgraded to 0.9%. Note 0.9%, less than 1% NAI, essentially economic stagnation. And the old imperial power, the UK, manages only a meager 0.1%. Another set of data, global trade contraction. The IMF expects world trade volume growth to plunge from 5% in 2025 to 3.5% in 2026 viron. A cliff-like drop. Behind these dry numbers lies an extremely bloody reality. The era of infinitely expanding the pie is completely over. Why did globalization advance so triumphantly over the past 30 years? Why could Western societies maintain that illusion of inclusivity, openness, and fraternity? Because the economy was growing, because the pie was getting larger. In an era of growth, it didn't matter if you took a bigger slice and I took a smaller one, because next year the pie would be even larger. Capitalists went overseas to set up factories, made profits, and chipped in a bit of tax to improve welfare for domestic workers. Everyone got along, but now the world has formally entered an era of stock, or even partial shrinkage. When the pie is no longer growing swen, and even shrinking wei, the rules of the game change completely. It turns from a cooperative win-win game into a brutal zero-sum contest. In a zero-sum game, human genetic instincts are fully triggered. Which instincts? Exclusionary instincts. There are only so many resources. If I don't push out outside competitors, my own interest will suffer. So why do Americans support Trump? Because Trump shouts, America first died to restrict imported goods, bring back military spending paid to NATO, export American energy, block Mexican immigrants, and protect American workers' jobs. Why do Europeans vote for the right? Because the right also shouts, our people first, to control refugees, counterbalance EU bureaucrats, and safeguard the welfare of local citizens. Against the backdrop of global economic downturn, the people of all countries are instinctively turning right, building walls to protect their existing interests. This is not a moral decline at all. It is the emergency response of human groups facing survival pressures. In times of prosperity, you can uphold fraternity and tolerance. But when the Titanic is about to sink, everyone will fight for a spot on a lifeboat. Today, the global economy, though the ship of globalization Doi, has not yet fully sunk, but its engines are clearly slowing. And with the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and other regional wars, the ship seems to be taking on water. European citizens are simply trying to prepare their life vests in advance. That's all there is to it. Oh, of course, it would be incomplete to reduce all of this to money. Some will objectify it, and since I frequently browse online platforms, I keep seeing all kinds of polarized arguments, with each side agonizing over who is righteous and who is evil. That has left a deep impression on me. So now, when I analyze issues, I always add an extra dimension to distinguish the underlying positions and the truth behind them. On Europe's current rightward shift, I personally think it is not just about money, because a human being is not a machine that only calculates tax rates and income and expenses, right? So as an ordinary person, When faced with rising living costs, they will certainly calculate whether they have enough money. But when faced with huge immigrant groups, they also ask, whose country is this anyway? Can I still decide who enters this land? And when confronted with aggressive LGBT policies, unquestionable diversity advocacy, and extreme animal rights activism, they also wonder, has the native way of life I grew up with become something I cannot even express openly? So what the right offers voters is really not just more economic benefits, but something vital that the establishment has completely ignored: a sense of control. Borders must be controlled by us. Laws must be governed by native citizens. The distribution of welfare must be in the hands of the nation. The country's culture cannot be unilaterally defined by international organizations, courts, and university professors. That is why the word used most frequently in right-wing campaigns is not take back. Take back the border. Take back the country. Take back the country. Take back sovereignty. Take back our original way of life. The more society makes its people feel they have lost control, the more attractive the phrase take back control becomes. In fact, last year when I watched Trump build a border wall on the US and Mexico border, I had a strong feeling. Why do so many Americans support Trump's wall? Essentially, it is to take control of their own territory and social order. Back in the day, we had a song called "The Great Wall Will Never Fall," with lyrics about the surging Yellow River Twain. What does that embody? It embodies the Chinese people's sense of control over their own land. The Great Wall defends the homeland. This country belongs to us Chinese, and outsiders are not allowed to trample in freely. Today, Americans building a border wall, free, the core logic is exactly the same: a thirst for control over their own borders. Putting economic interests aside, let's now sort out the complete logic from the perspective of cultural and sovereign control. The trajectory is actually very clear, and our analysis is essentially complete. The far-right's sweeping victory in Europe is not accidental, nor is it the result of external manipulation. It is an inevitable product of high inflation, unbalanced refugee welfare, and global economic stagnation working together. Now some will surely ask, since the people have voted for the right, can these right-wing politicians actually solve the problems after taking office? Can they really make Europe prosperous again? My personal view is that it is very difficult, 2D even impossible. Why? Because although right-wing politicians have keenly grasped the people's pain points, they do not have a magic bullet to cure the root problems. After the far right takes power, their toolkit is essentially two-pronged. First, tighten border controls, restrict immigration, and cut foreign aid. Second, promote trade protectionism, and resist EU uniform regulations. But can that solve the fundamental problems? Europe's fundamental problems are industrial hollowing out, severe population aging, and being comprehensively left behind by China and the US in core technologies like the internet, AI, and new energy. If you drive away refugees, who will serve tables for Europeans? Who will care for Europe's elderly? If you adopt trade protectionism, can you magically create a European company that can compete with Nvidia or BYD? That is simply unrealistic. So the far right, in power, cannot actually make the shrinking pie bigger again. All they can do is change the way the pie is sliced, take back the small portion that was originally allocated to foreign refugees and outsiders, and redistribute it to the native population. Fighting over existing stock is like taking painkillers. 4D, it treats the symptoms, not the root cause. Once the short-term dividends fade, Europeans will find that the deep-seated problems remain, and the economy is still stagnant. But this does not mean the wave of far-right rise will recede. On the contrary, as long as the global economy does not see another industrial revolution-level technological explosion, such as the full implementation of general artificial intelligence that fundamentally liberates productivity, and as long as the global economy remains in a depressed era of zero-sum stock competition, this tide of political polarization, social xenophobia, and collective right-wing shift will only grow stronger, with no turning back. Don't believe it. Just wait and see. Over the next 2 years, elections in various countries will certainly see right-wing forces growing stronger. It is rather brutal, But that is the inescapable law of historical cycles. There is nothing we can do about it. Alright, that's all for today. Thank you, and see you next time.